There were less than 6 hours until dawn, and that was all the time he had left to live. A voice in his head told him that with the first rays of the sun, Ziva Garen's creatures would emerge onto the surface and tear apart anyone who happened to be on their trail without the right of way. Darren Holt was standing on that very trail, 100 paces from the black mouth of the cave, and he had no right of way. Just an hour ago, he had been riding the night bus home from his shift, dozing by the window. Then there was a blinding light, the sensation of falling, and cold grass beneath his palms. Now, a foreign sky with 2 moons hung above him, and in that sky there wasn't a single familiar constellation. The voice called itself the Codex of Mezi. It spoke evenly and without emotion, like an announcer naming stations. The Codex informed him that Darren had been recognized as the heir apparent to the guardhouse at Zev Garen, since the previous caretaker had died 19 years ago, and the line of succession had reached a random soul from the outer worlds. Darren looked at the guardhouse. That was too generous a term for what he saw. A crooked log cabin with a caved-in roof and a door hanging by a single hinge. Inside, it smelled of dampness and mice. A layer of dust as thick as a finger lay on the table. The Codex continued speaking. The right of ownership does not take effect on its own. It must be activated before dawn. To activate it, you must place boundary fangs along the plot's perimeter. The fangs are in the guardhouse's crawl space. There are 47 of them. The property's perimeter is nearly 2,000 paces. If even one fang is not in place by the first ray of sunlight, the Codex will revoke the inheritance and the territory will revert to no man's land. Darren asked aloud what would happen to him. The Codex replied that a caretaker without a territory is treated as ordinary loot. Darren clenched his teeth and climbed down into the underground chamber. The fangs turned out to be stone pillars knee-high. Each weighed as much as a bucket of water. A spiral was carved at the top of each one, and the spiral glowed faintly green when Darren took a stone in his hands. He estimated the distance and the weight, and realized he could carry a maximum of 2 in a single trip. 24 trips across the uneven ground in the dark, along the cave from which death would emerge at dawn. He didn't waste time panicking. Panic is a luxury for those who have time to spare. He took off his belt and tied a makeshift shoulder sling out of the rope he'd found in the guardhouse. Now he could carry 4 fangs at a time. His back cracked on the very first ascent, but held up. The Codex illuminated the placement points with pale green circles right on the ground, and that was the only help it offered. The first fang sank into the ground with a dull click, and the spiral on it flashed brighter. Darren felt a strange warmth in his chest, as if someone had checked off an item on an invisible list. He moved on. The second point, the third, the 7th. At the 12th point, the trail reached the very edge of the cave's mouth, and for the first time, Darren heard sounds from below. Down there in the darkness, something was scraping and breathing. The breathing was polyphonic. He planted a stake and didn't run, but walked with a quick, steady stride. Because a person who runs stumbles, and anyone who stumbles here won't get back up. By midnight, he had planted 26 stakes. His palms were rubbed raw. He wrapped them in strips torn from his shirt and continued. At the 31st mark, the ground turned out to be rocky, and the stake would not go in. Darren pounded the ground with a piece of broken plank until he dug a hole of the required depth. It took nearly half an hour, and he felt those 30 minutes slipping away from his life right before his eyes. The sky in the east began to grow gray when there were 6 stakes left. The breathing from the cave grew louder. Now it was accompanied by clicking sounds, as if a multitude of claws were testing the stone's strength. The Codex dispassionately reported that there were 40 minutes until dawn. Darren hoisted all 6 stones onto his back at once. His spine screamed. He walked, counting his steps to keep his mind off the pain. The 45th thang, 46th. The final point glowed at the very edge of the cliff above the river, and he had to descend there over rocks wet with dew. He crawled down on all fours, pressing the fang to his chest as if it were a child. Once, his foot slipped, and he slid 2 meters down the scree, scraping his side. He didn't let go of the fang. Below, he pressed the stone into the glowing circle just as the first ray of sunlight touched the treetops of the distant forest. 47 spirals flared up simultaneously. A wave of green light ran along the perimeter and closed into a ring. The Codex announced that the Garen border domain had been activated and that the steward, Darren Holt, had assumed his duties. Then the Codex uttered a phrase that made Darren forget all about his scraped palms. Every creature crossing the domain's border is required to pay a toll of 1/10 of its power, or an equivalent amount of property. Refusal is not an option. The levy is collected automatically. Darren was still processing what he'd heard when the first wave of creatures surged out of the cave. There were about 30 of them, gray creatures the size of a large dog, with bare tails and snouts resembling both a rat and a lizard. The Codex referred to them as ash-ranked gray-skinned creatures. They charged straight at Darren, and he braced himself to die standing. But something unexpected happened at the line of their fangs. A green glow enveloped each creature at the edge of its body. The glow stripped away several claws and a patch of fur from each of them. The matter dissolved into the air and then reappeared in a neat pile on the porch of the guardhouse. The creatures shrieked and tumbled head over heels, losing all interest in Darren, as if paying the toll had erased from their minds the very reason they were running. They scattered across the plain to hunt, circling the man in a wide arc. Darren stood in the middle of the path, and a river of monsters flowed past him, yet not a single one dared to touch him. By noon, more than 200 creatures had crossed the border. The porch of the guardhouse was littered with claws, hides, bone plates, and murky pebbles in which the Codex recognized faint shards of projectiles. The Codex kept track aloud. He named each item and its value in local copper marks. By evening, the total had surpassed 300 marks. Darren didn't know the local prices, but Codex helpfully explained that a farmhand earned 3 marks a day. Darren sat down on a step and laughed for the first time in the past 24 hours. He laughed and couldn't stop, because just that morning, he had been a night loader with a phone bill to pay, and now he was sitting atop a mountain of monstrous trophies that had come right to his door. His laughter cut short when Codex, in an even voice, added a new line to the tally. He reported that a group of 9 armed men was approaching the western border of the domain, and that the toll rule made no distinction between monsters and humans. The 9 men were marching in a wedge formation, and at the tip of that wedge was a broad-shouldered man in boiled leather armor with 2 axes on his back. Darren stood on the trail 20 paces from the line of fangs and raised his empty palms to show he didn't want to fight. He didn't know how to fight anyway, and his only weapon was the boundary, one he himself didn't yet fully understand. The band came to a halt. The broad-shouldered man sized up Darren with the kind of gaze one might give a milestone, and shouted that they were a mercenary band led by Bragos Costa, heading to Zev Garen for cannonballs, and that the ragamuffin had better get off the trail. Darren replied that the trail now ran through private property, and that a toll of 1/10 was charged for passage. The band burst into a 9-throated cackle. Bregcast told his men that madmen swarm out of the caves every season like mosquitoes from a swamp. He moved forward without slowing his pace and crossed the line of fangs. A green glow enveloped him instantly. It pulled the purse from his belt, unfastened one of the 2 axes from its sling, and took a bundle of torches from his shoulder bag, and all of it vanished and reappeared on the porch of the guardhouse. Breg froze. The remaining 8 crossed the boundary in turn, and the same thing happened to each of them. For some, 1/10 of their coins vanished. The archer's quiver, containing 1/3 of his arrows, evaporated. For the young spearman, the glow drew a pale mist from his body, and the codex dryly reported that, in the absence of valuable property, the toll had been taken in the form of life force, and that the fighter would tire more quickly than usual for 2 weeks. The band grabbed their weapons. Darren stood motionless and spoke quickly, because he understood that he would remain alive only as long as he kept speaking. He said that he hadn't stolen their belongings, but had collected the lawful toll that the Codex levies on everyone without exception, and that more than 200 monsters had crossed the border that morning, and every one of them had paid. He gestured toward the porch, which was littered with claws and hides. He said he was ready to return the people's property in exchange for a conversation because, unlike monsters, people could be explained the rules to, and one could bargain with those who knew the rules. Breg lowered his axe, not because he believed him, but because he saw the porch. The mercenary had spent 20 years in dungeons and knew how to assess loot at a glance. On the porch lay a day's haul worth of a full-fledged band's loot, obtained without a single swing of a blade. He asked how a skinny, unarmed guy could rob hundreds of ashen creatures. Darren told them almost everything, concealing only his origins. He identified himself as the heir apparent. The Codex confirmed his words by etching a glowing line into the air above the border, a declaration of ownership visible to all. The mercenaries fell silent. As it turned out, in this world they knew what the old boundary rights were, but considered them fairy tales from the time of the first overseers. Darren returned everything he'd confiscated to the band, except for a bundle of torches, which he pointedly kept for himself as payment for the lesson. Then he made a proposal that made even his own palms sweat. He said the band could set up camp within his boundaries. Inside the boundary, monsters do not attack, because a creature that has paid the toll loses its aggression toward the Watcher and his guests. This meant a safe night's sleep right at the entrance to the dungeon. Any party in the world would have to spend half its strength on night watch and retreating to distant campsites. Breg's party could dive into Zev, rest 10 paces from him, and dive again. In return, Darren asked for 1/10 of the loot in addition to the toll, and a commitment to sell him the cores at a fair price rather than haul them to buyers 3 days' journey away. Breg thought about it for a long time. He walked along the border and watched as yet another pack of gray-furred beasts paid the price with their claws and scattered past the human camp without even turning their heads. The mercenary didn't believe in miracles, but he believed his own eyes, and his eyes showed him the safest campsite of all he'd seen in 20 years. He spat into his palm and held it out to Darren. That's how the estate got its first residents. The following days would have been a dull routine for Darren, had it not been for 3 events. First, the band's archer, named Tavish, tracked down a steel-ranked creature near the border, an armored crawler the size of a wagon. The crawler was emerging from the depths, and by all the rules of the genre, the 9 mercenaries were supposed to meet it with steel and lose 2 or 3 of their own. Instead, all 10 men, including Darren, stood behind the line and watched. The crawler crossed the boundary. The glow stripped 2 armor plates, each the size of a tabletop, from its back, and ripped a dull, fist-sized stone from its carcass. The Codex declared that a small steel rank projectile with an estimated value of 400 marks had been taken. The crawler hissed, turned around, and slithered back into the cave, unwilling to pay a second time on the way back. Tavish looked at the core, then at Darren, then back at the core. A week ago, the archer had been laughing the loudest of all, but now he said quietly, and almost fearfully, that last season the gang had paid for a core like this with the life of a shield-bearer. The second event was the trade. Breg gave Darren the gang's entire day's haul, and Darren paid him fairly according to the Codex's listed prices, which turned out to be a quarter more favorable than the prices offered by distant buyers. The mercenaries began calling him not a ragamuffin, but a steward, and there was no longer any mockery in that word. The third event occurred on the 9th day, and it was worse than the first two combined. That evening, by the campfire, Breg said he'd sent a message to his wife in the city, as he did every week, and that in the message, like a fool, he'd described the marvelous campsite near Zev. The mercenary realized what he'd done only after the mail rider had already carried the letter away. News of a plot of land where cannonballs fall right into the overseer's hands would reach the city in 3 days, and in the city sat the Merchants Guild and Baron Velgart Cram's governor, who considered all of Zev's lands to be his hunting grounds. Breg said that the Baron was a simple man. Anything that brings in money on his land must bring in money for him, and anything he doesn't want to share ceases to exist. Darren looked at his 47 glowing stones and asked whether the Codex would allow the border to withstand an assault, not from claws, but from seals and decrees. For the first time ever, the Codex paused before answering. Then it stated that the right of ownership is absolute within the border, but the border does not protect against what people do beyond it. For example, against blocked roads, against a ban on merchants buying his goods. From a warden's declaration of outlawry. On the 14th day, a covered wagon bearing a coat of arms in the shape of scales appeared on the western road, and the banner of the Vergate Merchants Guild hung above it. The wagon stopped exactly a step away from the line of fangs, and that told Darren more than any letters of credence. The guest knew where the boundary lay and knew what it entailed. A gaunt man stepped out of the wagon, wearing a gray traveling cloak over expensive cloth. He introduced himself as Master Orvin Tale, an authorized appraiser for the Vergate Trade Guild, and immediately, in an even voice, asked for permission to cross the border without paying a toll. Darren replied that the code made no exceptions and that the toll would be collected automatically. Tale nodded as if satisfied with the answer. He unfastened a purse from his belt, containing exactly 1/10 of his travel funds, hung it in plain sight, and stepped across the line. A glow swept up the purse and left everything else untouched. The Magister watched the vanishing coins with the gaze of a scientist observing an experiment. Then he asked to see the records. For the next 2 hours, Darren showed his guest around the estate. Tale looked at the stacks of sorted hides, the crates of claws, and the shelf where, under the code's protection, 4 small cannonballs already lay. The master asked questions as precise as the strikes of an awl. How many creatures pass through per day? What is the proportion of steel-grade hides? Do the hides deteriorate if left untreated? Could the overseer influence the amount of the toll? Darren answered honestly when he could, and remained silent when he didn't know the answer himself. The Codex prompted him with figures, and Darren began to realize that his invisible accountant was making a greater impression on the guild member than all the trophies combined. In this world, records of such precision did not exist. Toward the end, Tale stopped at the guardhouse, took out a wax-sealed tablet, and announced the purpose of their visit. The Vergate Guild was offering the overseer a contract. The guild would purchase all raw materials from the estate at fixed prices, establish a trading post there, and handle the export. Darren expected a catch, and he found one in the 3rd clause. The contract named Darren as the manager of Baron Cram's lands, while all tolls were to be the Baron's property, with the manager receiving a salary of 1/20th of the proceeds. Darren closed the tablet and returned it to the Magister. He said that he was ready to trade with the guild starting as early as tomorrow, but the estate would not be sold, leased, or renamed, because it was held not on paper, but by a right older than the Baron's lineage. Tail did not argue. He said that, personally, he was an appraiser, not a recruiter, and that the figures he had seen here spoke for themselves. Then he added the remark that was likely the reason for his trip. He said that Baron Cram had already sent his nephew to Zev with 24 lancers, and that this nephew was renowned for his ability to resolve land disputes before the law enforcement officers arrived. The Magister left, and Darren convened a council consisting of himself, Breg, and Codex. The gang could field 9 swordsmen against 20, and Breg frankly stated that this meant certain death. Codex explained that an armed incursion intended to seize property is classified differently than a peaceful crossing of the border. The border guards are entitled to take not a tenth, but half from the invader. But even half of 20 fighters would be enough to take on 9 mercenaries and 1 porter. Darren thought about it all night, and by morning he asked Codex a question that changed everything. He asked what happens to a creature that owes a toll but cannot pay it. The Codex replied that an insolvent creature becomes a debtor to the border and is obligated to work off the debt by serving the domain. The term of service is determined by the size of the debt. Darren smiled slowly. Right at the border, a creature had been prowling for 3 days, one that the mercenaries gave a wide berth. A twilight leader, a lunar rank predator resembling a wolf fashioned from shadow and smoke. Codex estimated its strength to be greater than that of the entire Bregos gang combined. The leader was old and hungry. Hunger drove him toward the surface, but he did not cross the border, as if sensing something was amiss. Darren ordered the carcass of yesterday's stag to be laid out just beyond the boundary line, right at its very edge, so that the prey could only be taken by reaching across the border. The plan was devious and simple. An emaciated creature carries neither possessions nor surplus strength. The toll for a lunar rank creature is enormous. The leader had nothing with which to pay. The leader circled the bait until sunset. Then hunger won out, and a shadow darted across the line. A glow flared up so brightly it hurt the eyes. The Codex stipulated that the duty on a lunar rank creature amounted to the equivalent of 6,000 marks, that the payer was insolvent, and that the debtor was to enter the service for a term of 1 year. Green spirals wrapped around the creature like a harness. The Twilight Chieftain stood before Darren and bowed his smoky head. Hatred burned in his eyes, mingled with the absolute impossibility of disobeying. The mercenaries watched in silence. Tavish whispered that now he had seen everything. And 2 days later, on the western road, dust rose from 20 horsemen, and above them fluttered the standard bearing the black boar of the Cram clan. Baron Gelvin Cram's nephew halted the detachment right at the border. He was young, imposing, and clad in excellent chainmail. He announced that, by the Baron's command, the self-appointed overseer was required to immediately clear the lands and transfer all property to the rightful owner of the lands. Darren stepped out to the border alone. He said he was giving the detachment 1 chance to turn back, and that anyone who crossed the boundary with a weapon and the intent to seize the land would forfeit half of everything they owned. Gelvin burst out laughing and spurred his horse on. 20 riders crossed the line at once. Not a single one of them ever forgot what happened next. The glow stripped the party of half their weapons, half their armor, and half their money, and drew a thick strand of life force from even the strongest among them. The horses paid the price with their stamina, and suddenly slowed from a trot to a stumbling walk. Gelvin remained in the saddle, without his sword, without his right shoulder guard, and without the entire squad's treasury he had been carrying. And then, the Twilight Chieftain emerged silently from behind the guardhouse, and simply stood next to Darren. The horses went wild at the mere scent of him. The decimated squad didn't flee only because there was nowhere to run on their exhausted horses. In the silence that followed, Darren spoke calmly and concisely. He said he would not harm anyone and that everyone could leave by the same road. He said that what the Mez had taken under the law of invasion would not be returned, but he was willing to return the property of the rank and file fighters because they were indentured servants. servants. The mez would keep Lord Gelvin's treasury and weapons as a lesson. He also asked that a message be relayed to the Baron that the overseer, Ziva Garuna, preferred to trade rather than fight, but that fighting the mez was more costly. The detachment departed at dusk, and the rank-and-file soldiers looked not at Darren, but at the mountain of their own weapons by the guardhouse. Breg stood next to the overseer and shook his head. The mercenary said that the young man had just publicly dishonored the Baron's bloodline, and that such acts are never forgiven. Baron Cram would not send another detachment. The Baron would send something worse than a detachment. The Baron's response came not in steel, but in silence, and that silence proved more terrifying than steel. A week after Gelvin's escape, not a single wagon appeared on the western road. 3 days later, Breg returned from a trip to a nearby village, as gloomy as a storm cloud. The mercenary reported that the Baron's outposts were stationed along all the highways, and that town criers had announced a decree. Anyone who trades with the overseer Zev must pay triple the tax. Anyone who is hired by him loses the right to work on the Cram lands. Anyone who brought him bread, salt, or iron was considered an accomplice to the usurper of the lands. The Baron had been unable to seize the borderlands by force, and now intended to take them by starvation. His calculation was precise. The borderlands provided Darren with claws, hides, and cannonballs, but yielded neither grain, nor vegetables, nor blacksmithing. The band's supplies would last 3 weeks. The wealth on the guardhouse shelves was rapidly turning into a pile of pretty junk, because wealth is only what can be exchanged. Tavish was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. The archer said that the band had signed up to guard the camp, not to die under siege, and that in 3 weeks they would all have to leave. Darren didn't argue. He went to the border and talked with Codex until dark. He asked about the boundaries of the domain and learned that the boundary could be expanded. Each boundary fang allowed for the growth of a daughter stone once every 7 days upon payment from the domain's treasury. Darren asked how far the Ziva cave system extended. Codex replied that the lower galleries stretched for dozens of versts and emerged to the surface in at least 4 places. One of the exits opened into a river gorge beyond the Baron's lands, on the territory of the free city of Virgate, the very city whose guild had sent Master Tail. The plan took shape by morning, and it was so audacious it made his ears ring. If the roads were blocked above ground, the trade route would run underground, through the dungeon itself, through galleries teeming with creatures that left the overseer and his debtors alone. Darren summoned the Twilight Leader, and for the first time gave the debtor a real assignment: to scout the lower passage to the river mouth and return with a scent map. The leader went into Zev and disappeared for 4 days, and during that entire time, Darren slept only 3 hours because he was expanding the boundary. He was placing subsidiary fangs in a chain, not around the domain, but inside the cave, along the main gallery. Each stone cost the treasury 40 marks, and each transformed another chunk of darkness into his territory, where tolls were levied and aggression was prohibited. Mercenaries carried the stones behind him, and Breg grumbled that in 20 years of descents, this was the first time he'd gone into the underground to do construction work instead of fighting. The creatures of the galleries crossed the new boundary, paid their dues, and lost their malice. By the time the leader returned, Darren's underground trail had extended 800 paces into Zev. The leader had brought back the most important news. The lower passage existed and was passable. It took just over a day's journey through the galleries from the guard post to the river mouth. Then Darren made a move that Breg later called the greatest mercantile folly in this world. He wrote a letter to Master Orvin Teal and sent it with Tavish over the hills, bypassing the checkpoints. In the letter, the overseer offered the Virgate Guild something no one else could offer: a direct trade route from the richest underground realm to the free city through the galleries, protected by boundary rights. No baronial taxes, because there is no baronial land underground. No losses from beasts, because the entire route lies within the domain. The guild receives a monopoly on the purchase of raw materials from the borderlands at a 1/10 discount for 5 years. In return, the guild transports grain, iron, tools, and skilled workers. The reply arrived faster than Darren dared to hope. Tale arrived in person, not from the west, but from the gorge along the river, and his boat carried sacks of flour as a gesture of goodwill. The Magister traveled along the scouted route from the river mouth to the guard post, accompanied by the chieftain as his guide, and emerged from Zeva, pale from the experience, but with eyes ablaze. The appraiser said he had seen a steel-ranked creature crawl out to meet the caravan, pay the toll, and indifferently yield the path. He said that for such a route, the guild would have fought a dozen barons. The contract was signed on the guardhouse porch, and the codex fused its terms into the light between worlds, making any violation impossible for either side. From then on, time flew by in a flurry of eventful days. The first caravan, consisting of 12 porters, traveled along the underground path, and above ground it was greeted as a miracle. 2 weeks later, a rail trough for mine cars was already being laid along the gallery, and the guild's craftsmen were driving in support timbers beneath the light of the boundary spirals. A month later, 4 new log structures, a warehouse, and a smithy stood by the guardhouse, and the blacksmith from Vergate, who had moved there with his family, was reforging the armor plates of the sliders into shields that were shipped to the city at the price of a good horse apiece. Bregg's band had grown to 26 swordsmen because mercenaries from all over the region were begging to join the border guard, where they could sleep safely and their spoils were paid out honestly on the spot. Meanwhile, Baron Velgart Cram stood with his outposts on the deserted roads, slowly realizing that he had blocked the routes that no one intended to travel anymore. This month's skeptic was neither a warrior nor a merchant, but the Baron's tax collector, Odo Fenk, who had spent years collecting taxes from the border villages. Fenk rode to the outpost to inspect the moat, and from the hill saw the smoke rising from 4 new furnaces, a palisade under construction, and a caravan of wagons disappearing underground. The tax collector had spent his entire life counting other people's money and knew how to estimate turnover by the smoke and the roofs. He sat in the saddle, moving his lips as he counted, his face growing more drawn with every number. That evening, Fenk wrote a report to the Baron, in which, for the first time in his life, he advised his lord not to exert pressure, but to negotiate. The Baron tore up the report, and a day later, something happened that pushed the Baron, the guild, and all human calculations into the background. That night, Darren woke up to the sensation of all 47 of his fangs buzzing. The codex spoke louder than usual, and for the first time, something resembling tension could be heard in its even voice. The codex reported that the deep horizons of Zev had begun to stir, that once in a generation, the underworld expels its excess population to the surface, a phenomenon known as the tide. That, based on the combined indicators, the tide would begin within the next 10 days. And that not dozens of creatures per day, but thousands in a single night would cross the border. Cram imposed a trade blockade, but Darren expanded the border with his subordinate clans deep into Zev, scouted the lower passage to the river mouth with his chieftain, and concluded an agreement with the Vergate Guild on an underground trade route bypassing the Baron's lands. Within a month, the estate had grown into a fortified settlement with a warehouse, forges, and a band of 26 swordsmen. The Baron's tax collector, Odo Fenk, having assessed the trade volume, advised the Baron to negotiate, but was ignored. The Codex announced that in 10 days, the tide of Zeva would begin, and thousands of beasts would emerge at the boundary in a single night. In the 10 days leading up to the tide, Darren lived as if every day were the last peaceful day of his life, and in essence, it was. The Codex explained the mechanics of the threat without embellishment. The boundary would collect a toll from every creature and remove the aggression from each one that paid. But the toll was collected at the line, and the line had a limited capacity. If hundreds of bodies struck a single point on the border at the same time, the stones wouldn't have time to process them all, and part of the flow would break through into the interior, unpaid and hostile. The solution was an engineering one, not a military one, and for the first time, Darren felt that his past life as a porter and his current life as a guard were finally speaking the same language. The flow did not need to be stopped, but rather directed and spread out. He bought up the guild's entire stock of scaffolding and hired 400 workers for a week. A funnel of palisades rose before Zev's maw, splitting any outgoing stream into 6 narrow channels. Each channel led to its own gate along the boundary line, and at each gate, Darren set up 3 subsidiary fangs, tripling the speed of collection. Beyond the gates, the channels fanned out across the steppe so that the creatures who had paid their dues would not gather in a crowd, but would immediately disperse across the plain. Brago stationed his men on platforms above the channels, not for combat, but to keep watch, with crossbows at the ready, just in case. The Twilight Chieftain, accompanied by 2 new, larger debtors, took up a position right at the mouth of the chasm to push the stream away from the funnel's walls. The guildmasters, watching this construction, shook their heads in disbelief, and the senior foreman remarked that the overseer was building not a fortress, but a mill for monsters. On the night of the high tide, no one slept. The earth trembled an hour before midnight. A blast of hot air and the stench of deep-seated rot poured from Zev's maw, and then the darkness inside the cave stirred and flowed outward. Darren stood on the central platform and watched as a living river flowed toward his funnel. The gray-skinned creatures rolled forward like a solid carpet. Horned beasts leaped above them. Crawlers slithered down the cave walls. The first impact struck the fork in the palisade, and the logs groaned but held firm, and the river obediently split into 6 branches. And then began the very reason for which everything had been built. The gates flashed green and did not go out until morning. The boundary collected its toll in a continuous stream. The codex switched to a rapid-fire stream of dry reports, and Darren ordered it to state only the cumulative total because the individual figures had merged into a din. 1,000 marks, 3,000, 7,000. A bottleneck formed at the 4th gate when 3 crawlers burst through the passage at once, and the crowd pressing from behind scrambled over the palisade. 2 of the creatures that had climbed over were taken down by Bregg's crossbowmen, while the 3rd was met by the leader, and that exhausted the human toll for the night's battle. 2 lightly wounded for the entire night of the onslaught. The next morning, the steppe stretched to the horizon, teeming with creatures scattering, sated by their own freedom, while the crater stood sunken but intact. The codex announced the total, and silence hung over the boundary as the people tried to grasp the figure. In a single night, the estate had collected a toll from 4,300 creatures, totaling 51,000 marks, including 19 small cores, 6 full steel rank cores, and 2 lunar cores. Bregg stepped onto the platform and said that in a single night, the overseer had earned more than the Cram barony collected in taxes in a year. And then he added that now they would have to defend this not just against the Baron. The following weeks were spent in construction, which Darren later recalled as one long, happy hum. Upon learning of the bountiful harvest, the guild sent a second work crew, and caravans began traveling along the underground route daily. A proper palisade with 2 towers was erected at the guardhouse. The street grew from 8 houses to 15. A tavern opened, run by the blacksmith widow from Veergate. At Darren's request, Codex started a register of residents, and 64 names were entered into it. People began calling the settlement Mejov Dvor, and the name stuck. The skeptic of those weeks was the merchant Cyrus Mon, co-owner of Veergate's second-largest trading house, who had spent his entire life scoffing at the guild's tales of the miraculous boundary and had come in person to expose the hype. Mon walked around Mejov Dvor for 2 days with the expression of a man chewing on a lemon. He felt the armor shields. He counted the wagons. He weighed cannonballs in the palm of his hand. On the third day, his face relaxed, and he asked Darren for a private meeting, during which he offered to invest 20,000 marks in the city's completion in exchange for a share of future customs duties. Darren refused the share because the boundary cannot be divided, but offered Mona the chance to buy out the first row of shops, and the merchant agreed so quickly that it became clear just how profitable he considered even that to be. And at the end of the month, a letter arrived from Baron Cram. It was neither a decree nor a threat, but rather a letter in which the Baron, for the first time, referred to Darren as the overseer and proposed negotiations to lift the checkpoints in exchange for a share in the caravan trade. Odo Fenk added a single line at the bottom, stating that he was glad the Baron had finally reread his report. Darren read the letter atop the palisade tower and allowed himself a smile. The estate had withstood the beasts, the weapons, and the blockade. Ahead lay negotiations, construction, and the first real city at the entrance to the dungeon. The smile faded from his face along with the sunset. That night, all the fangs between the walls flashed at once, not green, but a deep blue, and the Codex spoke in a tone Darren had never heard before. The Codex reported that a solitary creature of the granite rank was rising from the lower horizons toward the surface, an intelligent one, Ziva, Lord of the Depths, whose name appeared in the Codex's registry as Garen, and after whom the people had once named the cave itself. The creature moved slowly and openly, not like a beast, but like a lord surveying his lands. And the Codex added one final detail. The tide was no accident. The tide was a census. Garen had counted his subjects and discovered that 1/10 of the power of each of the 4,000 had seeped to the surface. And now he was ascending in person to see who dared to collect taxes from his people. Darren prepared for the tide by constructing a funnel of palisades with 6 branches and triple fangs at the gates. And in a single night, the border collected a toll of 51,000 marks from 4,300 creatures, with 2 sustaining minor injuries. The settlement grew into Mezhevoy Dvor, with a palisade-lined street and 64 residents. The skeptical merchant Cyrus Mon invested in the row of shops, and Baron Cram himself proposed negotiations. The Codex announced that the tide was a census, and that a rational lord of the depths of granite rank named Garen was rising to the surface to personally inspect the one who was collecting taxes from his subjects. Garen ascended for 3 days, and for all 3 days the boundary court lived as if on a powder keg. The Codex tracked the Lord's movement by the tremors of the deep horizons, and reported a new reading every few hours. Darren's first question was the most important one. Would the boundary collect a toll from a granite rank creature? And what would happen if it refused to pay? The Codex replied slowly and honestly. The toll would be levied as it is on everyone, but the boundary's authority rests on the power of the boundary stones, and the power of the stones grows from the accumulated treasury and the age of the domain. Darren's domain was less than 3 months old. A granite rank creature, if it wished, could force its way through the collection, overload the stones, and enter without paying. The Codex estimated the probability of a successful breach at 6 out of 10, and if the stones were to fail under the overload, the border would be completely extinguished, and restoration would take a year. Darren listened to this while standing on the tower and didn't say a word. He went downstairs and began preparing, not for defense, because defense against such a threat was laughable. He began preparing for negotiations. His first order was to halt all caravans and evacuate everyone from the galleries. Second, he ordered the Codex to prepare a complete inventory of everything taken from Zev's subjects over the past 3 months, down to the last claw and the last scale. By his third order, he asked Breg to lead the women and children out of the settlement to the river mouth, and for the first time since they'd known each other, Breg carried out the order without a single word. Cyrus Mon refused to leave. The merchant said he had invested 10,000 marks in the trading row, and wished to see his investment with his own eyes, whether alive or dead. By evening on the third day, Garin emerged from Zev's maw. He resembled neither a wolf nor a lizard nor anything with a name in human books. He looked like a chunk of mountain that had grown tired of lying there. 4 meters of gray stone, veined with dull light, with a face that looked as if someone had sketched it onto the rock with a few blows and left it unfinished. His footsteps echoed in the souls of everyone standing on the walls. The creatures scattering across the steppe lay flat on their bellies at the mere sight of him. Garin approached the boundary line and stopped. He examined his nearest fang for a long time, just as a jeweler examines another's work. Then he spoke, and his voice came not from his throat, but from the earth, so everyone heard him deep in their bones. The Lord said he sensed the ancient law here, the law of the first watchers, with whom his people had made a pact before humans had grown weak and forgotten everything. He asked who was guarding the boundary here. Darren stepped out through the gate alone. His legs felt like cotton, and he walked slowly so it wouldn't be noticeable. He stopped 5 paces from the line and identified himself as the Watcher, Darren Holt. Garin bowed his stone head and said that the Watcher had been robbing his subjects for 3 moons in a row, and that, according to all the laws of the depths, the punishment for such an offense was to tear down the boundary along with its keeper. Then the Lord added a word that Darren would later recall as the most precious word of his life. Heron said, "However," he added, "however, the old agreement stated that the toll at the entrance was not robbery, but a fee for order. The overseers of the past kept the surface in check. They did not allow armies with fire to approach the caves. They did not permit the digging of poisoned traps. They returned to the depths the young ones who had strayed above. In return, the people of the depths paid a passage tithe and considered it fair. Garoon asked if the new guardian was ready to uphold the old agreement, or if he was merely a collector of others' wealth. Darren thought for 3 heartbeats and replied with a question. He asked what the people of the depths lacked that the surface had. The stony face twitched, perhaps in surprise. Garoon replied that the depths lacked salt, metal, fiery wood, and knowledge of what was happening above. For centuries, his subjects had obtained all of this through plunder, losing warriors in the process. And then Darren proposed something that, according to Mona's own later admission, made the back of the man standing on the wall break out in a sweat. The overseer proposed a trade agreement to the Lord of the Depths. Mez continues to collect a tithe at the entrance as payment for order and the agreement, but a trading post is established at the gates where the people of the depths can buy salt, iron, and everything they need, paying with cores, hides, and depth stone, according to the fair accounting of the Codex. The beasts stop raiding the villages, because raiding becomes pointless when trade is available. People stop slaughtering the beasts for their claws, because claws can be bought, and the Overseer is accountable to the Lord of the Depths for ensuring that no army from the surface approaches Zev. Garoon was silent for so long that the sky had time to darken. Then the Lord stretched his stone hand across the boundary, palm up, and the Codex immediately declared that a granite rank duty had been presented, and that the payer was paying voluntarily. Resting in the palm was a black glass egg the size of a human head. The Codex delivered its appraisal with a hesitation that Darren heard for the first time. A heartstone of the depths, equivalent to 200,000 marks. The duty was paid in advance for 100 years. Garoon said the agreement was accepted, and that once a month he would send a messenger to reconcile the accounts. Then the mountain turned and disappeared into the maw of Zev, and the earth trembled for a long time afterward. No one on the wall could speak. Cyrus Mon was the first to pass away. The merchant slid down the stairs, approached Darren, and said that he'd been trading for 40 years and thought he'd seen every market in the world. But now, right before his eyes, a market had opened up with the underworld, and he wanted to know the price of front row seats here. That night, the Boundary Court didn't sleep, but it was the sleeplessness of of celebration. And Darren sat over the hearthstone and listened to the codex, which explained that an estate that had received a granite rank payment changed its status. Garoon's boundary was now listed in the registry as a free third-tier boundary. This granted the right to mint its own registration mark, hold court on its own land, and administer the oath to its residents. And according to the codex, this also meant that the estate had become visible, not for barons, for those who maintain registers above the barons. The codex stated that the royal chamber of lands in the capital, Arvenholm, had been automatically notified of the change in status, and that in the entire history of the chamber, notification of a new free territory had reached it only twice. Both times, war broke out afterward. Garoon, Lord of the Depths, went out to the boundary, recalled the old agreement between the First Wardens and Darren, and, instead of conflict, offered him a trade agreement with a trading post at the gates. Garoon voluntarily paid the duty in Heartstones, 200,000 marks in advance, and promised to send a messenger once per moon, while the merchant Mon requested a place in the new trade. The domain became a free third-tier borderland with the right to mint marks and administer justice. But word of this reached the Royal Chamber of Lands in Arvenholm, and both previous instances of this had ended in war. The morning after Garoon's departure began with a dispute that nearly split the border court in two. Bregor demanded that the treaty with the Depths, because trading with creatures in this world had been punishable by burning in the town squares even in his grandfather's time. Mon demanded that the agreement be proclaimed from every corner, because silence would not hold anyway, and it was better to call things by their beneficial names themselves than to let foreign tongues label them as terrible. Darren listened to both of them and looked out at the square where craftsmen were already staking out the site for the trading yard. He chose a third path, neither to remain silent nor to shout, but to demonstrate. A week later, when the first speaking Garuna emerged from Zev, the overseer turned the reconciliation of accounts into a public spectacle. The speaker turned out to be a creature about the height of a teenager, resembling an owl with arms carved from gray stone. It called itself Krek and sat down at the negotiating table in full view of the entire village and 36 visiting merchants. The codex read the tally aloud. Krek laid out cores and slabs of deep stone on the table. Mona's clerks laid out blocks of salt and bundles of iron rods. People stood around watching as the monster from the cursed cave haggled over the price of salt, its stony face expressing such a familiar merchant's sorrow that someone in the crowd laughed. The first laugh was followed by a second. An hour later, the square was buzzing like a regular market, and the fear died down of its own accord without a single word spoken. This week's skeptic was Father Gaspar, a priest from the roadside temple who had arrived from the city with the firm intention of excommunicating Mez for colluding with the devil. Gaspar stayed in Mezov Devor for 3 days. He watched as Krek haggled over the salt. He saw the creatures who had paid their toll drinking peacefully from the river, side by side with the caravanners' horses. He saw food being brought to a wounded mercenary at the new inn free of charge, by order of the overseer. On the 4th day, the priest went to Darren and said that he had come seeking an unholy pact, but had found what his faith calls the reconciliation of the material world, something written about in the oldest books of his temple. Gaspar asked permission to build a chapel in the settlement, and Darren set aside a spot between the inn and the warehouse, reasoning that a chapel would reassure the doubters better than any decree. The next month was spent on construction. The trading post was rebuilt in 9 days and immediately became the heart of the settlement. Caravans from Veergate traveled along the underground route daily, and the guild requested that the trench be widened to accommodate a second track. Baron Cram arrived for the negotiations in person, lifted the roadblocks, signed a caravan agreement with a 1/20th share, and took home a gift from the border, an armored shield engraved with a boar, which, according to reports from the tax collector Fank, put him in an almost human mood. food. The register of residents grew to 140 names. Darren introduced his own accounting token bearing the imprint of a boundary fang, and within a month, the token began to circulate more readily throughout the district than the Baron's silver, because it was backed by the treasury, which everyone could see with their own eyes. The Codex established a section of laws, and Darren wrote the first 6 brief rules of the Boundary Court, beginning with the rule that every transaction on this land must take place in the presence of a witness from the Codex, and therefore there is no deception here. And then the Chamber of Lands arrived from Arvenholm. It arrived in the form of a single man, and this man proved more formidable than 20 of Gelvin's horsemen. The royal surveyor, Iona Work, was short in stature, gray-haired, and polite to a fault. He arrived with 2 clerks and a charter granting him the right to enter anywhere and ask anything. He paid the border toll with a coin counted out in advance, with the same precision once displayed by Master Tail. Verk spent 6 days at the Boundary Court and did not ask a single question about the creatures. He was interested in other matters. Who had signed the settlement's charter? To whom did the residents swear allegiance? In whose name is justice administered? By what right is the coin minted? Darren answered by referring to the status of the free boundary, and Verk nodded and took notes each time, and those nods were colder than the roar of any creeper. On the 7th day, the surveyor asked to speak in private and laid out the crux of the matter. The kingdom recognizes the ancient boundary law and will not contest its status, but the free borderland, according to those same ancient laws, must make a choice. Either it swears allegiance to the crown and receives protection and a permanent place in the registry, or it must declare itself a free city on par with Vergate, in which case it is obligated to maintain its own army, defend its walls, and take responsibility for its section of the kingdom's border. There is no third option, because a power vacuum on the map is a gap, and gaps drag out the war. Verk gave them until the Chamber's winter session to reach a decision, 4 months. And just as he was about to leave, the surveyor added one last remark as matter-of-factly as if he were discussing the weather. He said that Darren should make a decision sooner than the announced deadline, because the Chamber of Lands wasn't the only one who had read the notice about the new free territory. The College of Keys had read it as well. Darren asked what that was. For the first time in 6 days, Verk hesitated before answering. Then he said that the Collegium was the body that, on behalf of the crown, oversaw all the dungeons of the kingdom, and that the Collegium had an old score to settle with any living overseer. 19 years ago, the former overseer, Zeva Garuna, did not die of old age. His boundary was extinguished, and it was extinguished by the man who now holds the second highest ranking key in the College of Keys. Darren learned the enemy's name before he saw his face. After rummaging through its own old records, the Codex provided a terse report. 19 years ago, the Garuna estate was extinguished by strangling the treasury. Someone secured a royal ban on trade with the steward, bought up all the estate's debts through frontmen, and demanded payment all at once during a year of crop failure. The estate could not afford to maintain the fangs. The stones went dark, and on the very first night without protection, Zeva's beasts overran the guardhouse. Caretaker Old Marin perished on the threshold. And a month later, the man who had orchestrated the financial strangulation received permission from the College of Keys to remove all 47 dead fangs from the extinguished Meha and transport them to the capital for study. His name was Halvar Dukes, and he was now known as the second keykeeper of the college. The Codex added a detail that made Darren's jaw clench. The fangs of the current boundary were those very 47 stones. Dukes had studied them for 9 years, failed to revive them, and written them off as junk. And the junk, according to the inventory, had been returned to the guardhouse's cellar. It turned out that Darren possessed an object that the most dangerous man in the kingdom considered his own failure. And people like Duke do not forgive their failures for having a habit habit of coming to life in the hands of others. The Collegium's first move came a month later, and it was deceptively peaceful. An inspection team of 3 junior-ranking officials arrived at Mezervoy Dvor with orders to conduct an inventory of Zev Garen's dungeon as a site under royal supervision. Formally, there was nothing to object to. The college had the right to inspect any dungeon. In reality, the inspection meant that outsiders with official authority would enter the galleries, where an agreement with Garen was in effect prohibiting the entry of armed units. Darren found himself caught between a royal decree and a promise made to the Lord of the Depths, and he understood that he had been deliberately trapped. If he refused the inspection, he would become a rebel. If he allowed it, he would break the agreement with the Depths, with all the consequences that entailed. He found a loophole in the system during a single sleepless night. The next morning, the overseer met the keykeepers at the gate with his full consent and one amendment. The inventory would proceed, but it would be conducted by the Codex, and the inspectors would receive the certified documents without entering the galleries. Because, under the treaty with the Lord of the Depths, armed entry there was prohibited for everyone, including the overseer himself. Instead, Darren offered the keykeepers something no supervisory body in the kingdom had ever seen: a direct conversation with the intelligent Lord of the Underworld through a spokesperson, a first-hand inventory. The senior inspector spent a long time reading the treaty with Garen, which was inscribed in the light of the boundary, then looked at Krek, who was just haggling in the square over a batch of salt, and finally said that in 20 years of service, he had inventoried 40 dungeons. But this was the first time a dungeon had voluntarily agreed to provide testimony. The inspection team took 300 pages of the inventory and Garen's personal message to the Collegium back to the capital. A message consisting of a single sentence stating that the depths of Zev would honor the agreement as long as the surface honored it. Duke's second move was more underhanded. 2 weeks later, the first attack in the history of the boundary occurred on the underground route. Not beasts, people. 8 mercenary swordsmen in blank masks entered the gallery from the river mouth, slaughtered the guards at the railcar junction, wounded 2 guild workers, and attempted to plant barrels of flammable oil in the fortifications. The boundary caught them. After the inspection, Darren managed to extend a chain of subsidiary fangs all the way to the estuary, and the attackers, without realizing it, walked across his territory the entire way. The Codex waited for the moment of the arson, classified the incident as an invasion with intent to destroy, and took not half, but everything from each of them. 8 people at once were stripped of their weapons, clothing, money, and a year's worth of vitality, and the guards bound them naked and exhausted. Breg conducted the interrogation, and 3 of the 8 knew the name of the employer, the middleman. The trail led to the capital, to an office that, according to Mona, had been serving the interests of the college for 30 years. There was no evidence against Duke himself, and Darren realized there never would be. People like that don't leave a paper trail. That night, for the first time in a long while, he sat alone in the tower and honestly asked himself whether a porter could outplay the kingdom's second chief keykeeper on a board that the latter had been building for 19 years. The answer came from a direction he hadn't expected. At dawn, the Codex reported that the speaker Krek was requesting an urgent meeting. The Stone Owl listened to the account of the attack and said that Lord Garen had foreseen something like this and had ordered that the knowledge be passed on to the Keeper. The Depths remember the night the former boundary was extinguished. They remember because they witnessed it from below, and on that night, 19 years ago, Zev's creatures did not take the watchtower of their own accord. They were driven upward by a call, an artificial call from a deep horn, which only the masters of the college know how to make. Caretaker Old Marin did not die because his boundary went out. His boundary was extinguished to conceal a murder, and the murder was committed by a horn that unleashed a surge upon the defenseless house. Garen was ready to testify to this before anyone, because that call had led 4,000 of his subjects into the meat grinder at the surface, and for 19 years the Lord of the Depths had considered this debt unpaid. Darren listened and felt the fear inside him slowly transform into something else, something cold and very calm. What he had in his hands was not merely a fief that dukes wanted to strangle. What he had in his hands was a witness to murder. The first witness of the granite rank in the kingdom's history. All that remained was to solve a problem that would make any lawyer in this world throw up their hands in despair. How to force the royal court to hear a monster. The answer came from Iona Work, who had arrived that same week to deliver documents for the Winter Assembly. The surveyor listened to everything in silence, as was his habit, nodding and taking notes. Then he said that the court would not hear the monster, but the Winter Assembly of the Chamber of Lands is not a court. It is a gathering where free cities and estates report to the crown, and where, according to ancient regulations, any party to any land agreement has the right to speak. The treaty between Darren and Garin is incorporated into the boundary and ratified by the Codex. Formally, the Lord of the Depths is a party to a land agreement recognized by the kingdom. Formally, he has the right to send a spokesperson to the assembly. Work took off his glasses, wiped them, and added that he had been keeping the chamber's minutes for 40 years, and for the first time in his life, he was truly looking forward to attending the Winter Assembly. Darren's enemy turned out to be the second keeper of the college, Halvar Dux, who, 19 years ago, had strangled the treasurer of the former boundary and concealed the murder of the overseer Old Marin by staging an artificial tidal surge triggered by the Horn of the Depths. Darren fended off the college's inspection with an open inventory via the Codex and the Speaker, and then the boundary captured all 8 saboteurs on the underground route. But the evidence against Dux trails off at the intermediary. Garin offered to testify to the murder through the spokesperson, and the surveyor Verk suggested a loophole. As a party to the recognized land agreement, the Lord of the Depths has the right to send the spokesperson to the Chamber of Lands Winter Convention. There were 11 weeks left until the Winter Assembly, and Darren was waging a war for the first time in which it was impossible to erect a palisade. The war was fought over papers, rumors, and what Mon called, with a long word, reputation. Dukes struck first and struck hard. A rumor spread through the cities of the kingdom that the overseer Zeva had sold himself to the beasts that were buying up iron through the exchange court to forge the claws of a future war, and that the mark of the boundary court was minted on the blood of Christian infants, the latter absurdity being the one most eagerly repeated. 3 of Arvenholm's trading houses severed their contracts with the Vergit Guild. The roadside shrines of the 2 provinces announced to pilgrims that the land of the boundary was defiled, and a petition from 12 barons was submitted to the Chamber of Lands, declaring the free boundary a threat to the crown, accompanied by a list of witnesses ready to swear that they had seen nocturnal gatherings of monsters at Zev's. Dukes had purchased the list of witnesses openly, because buying witnesses in this kingdom was not considered a crime, as long as the witnesses spoke truthfully after being paid. Darren gathered his staff by the stove in the guardhouse. Mon was in charge of the merchant cities and took their not rebuttals but samples. Armored shields, deep steel, and the ledgers of the Codex, open to any literate person. The merchant said that words were powerless against rumors, but merchandise that people wanted to buy was all-powerful. Father Gaspar volunteered to visit the roadside churches and took with him a single sermon consisting of an invitation. Come and see for yourselves. Breg took on the riskiest task and set out with 2 veterans to the villages, around which the border had, over the past 6 months, put an end to the creature's raids, to collect the village elders' signatures on a document stating that, with the arrival of the overseer, for the first time in a generation, no one had buried murdered shepherds. But Darren stayed home because the most important preparations were underway there. The speaker's attendance at the convention hinged on a task that Verk had warned him about separately. The Chamber's regulations required that the party to the agreement appear in person or send a representative of flesh and blood capable of taking an oath on the Chamber's registry stone. The registry stone distinguished a living oath from empty words and burned liars. No one knew whether the ancient stone would accept the oath of a creature of the depths. If the stone rejected Krek, the college would have the right to declare the entire agreement with Garin null and void, and with it, the status of the free border and everything else. Dukes surely knew the regulations better than anyone, and had undoubtedly counted on this when he allowed the matter to reach the assembly instead of quietly stifling it. He wanted not merely to defeat Darin, but to publicly depose him before the eyes of the entire kingdom. The Codex offered the only way to mitigate the risk. The Chamber's registry stone and the boundary fangs originated from the same era and the same school of masters. A test could be conducted. They could take an oath on a native boundary fang, according to all the rules of the ancient rite, and see if the stone would accept the words of a creature of the depths. The rite was performed at night without an audience. Krek placed his stone palms on the very first fang, the one Darin had once set at the cliff's edge above the river, and recited the formula for the witness oath that Verk had transcribed from the Chamber's archives. The fang flashed, not with green or blue, but with a steady white light that Darin had never seen before. The Codex remained silent for 10 long heartbeats, then announced that the oath had been accepted and entered into the register of the boundary, and that by all indications, the ancient stones made no distinction between the races of the speakers. The distinction between a deep one and a human turned out to be a later invention than the stones themselves. That night, Darin slept peacefully for the first time in a month, but the next morning, trouble came from a fourth direction, from where no one had expected it. From the south, beyond the steppe fords, a half-dead messenger from Baron Cram rode up. The messenger brought news that an army was marching through the Baron's lands toward Zev. Neither the kings nor the barons. The free army of the Grey Spear. 400 mercenaries whose commander, Magnus Rowe, had publicly declared that he was coming to purge the cursed border at the behest of an unnamed employer, and that anyone who stood in his way would share the fate of the unholy. Baron Cram reported that his retinue of 70 spearmen had barricaded themselves inside the castle, and that he was honestly warning his partner that he could not help. Dukes stopped playing cards. There were 7 weeks left until the convention, and the second chamberlain decided that a dead overseer would have no use for the convention. Darin looked at the map and did the math. The walls of the boundary court could hold off a raid by beasts, but not a siege by 400 professionals with siege supplies. Bregg's band had grown to 40 swordsmen. The militia of local residents provided another 70 men who could hold a spear, if only they didn't drop it. The border would take out half of the attackers on the front line, but Magnus Rowe apparently knew about the toll, because he was leading a convoy of double supplies, preparing to pay with iron and rags while preserving his fighters. The math was grim. And then Darin did what he had forbidden himself to do from the very first day. He went to Zev's lair and asked the depths for military aid. The conversation with Garin, conducted through Krek, who had been summoned in a hurry, was the most difficult one yet. The Lord reminded him that the agreement obligated the overseer himself not to let the army near the caves, and asked what a guard asking for protection from those he was supposed to protect was worth. Darin answered without beating around the bush. He said that the guard could be killed, and then the agreement would die with him, and the next person to come to Zev would come not from the borderlands, but with the Horn of the Depths, just as they had 19 years ago. He was not asking Garin's subjects to fight for the people. He was asking the Lord to show the surface, just this once, what happens to those who come to Zev bearing fire, to show, not to kill. Garin remained silent through Krek for so long that it had grown dark outside the guardhouse window. Then the Lord replied that he agreed, that the price of this service would be named after the Congress, and that the overseer would not like the price. Darin agreed without knowing the price, realizing that this was precisely how the worst treaties in history were signed, but he had no choice. The army of the Grey Spear approached the border 9 days later at dawn. Magnus Rowe formed his hundreds into 3 lines, sent the shield-bearers forward with carts of scrap iron to pay the toll, and did everything competently, unhurriedly, and fearsome. And then the ground before his formation reared up. From the steppe soil, which had been laced with offspring fangs overnight, Zeva's creatures rose. Not dozens, thousands. Garen brought the population of 3 horizons to the surface and arrayed them as a silent wall from one end of the valley to the other. The armored crawlers stood like living bastions. Twilight chieftains sat upon their backs. Behind them, all the way to the cave's mouth, a gray sea stirred, and above it all, on a mound, stood the Lord of the Depths himself, looking down upon the 400 men. Not a single creature took a step forward. They simply stood there, and that was enough. A mercenary fights for pay, and there is no pay for fighting a mountain. The third line was the first to retreat. By noon, the army of gray spears was moving away from Zev, quickening its pace, and before leaving, the condottiero Magnus Rowe rode up to the gates, removed his helmet, and told Darren 2 things. First, that the contract was terminated and he would collect the penalty from the employer personally. Second, that he had been hired through that very same agency in the capital and was ready to confirm this anywhere, because the employer had not warned him about the true strength of the enemy, and such a breach is not forgiven in the mercenaries' code. Darren watched the departing troops and felt no sense of victory. He felt the weight of Garen's unspoken price and the approaching tournament, where he would have to face a man who had just shown he was ready for anything. They set out for Arvenholm 2 weeks before the tournament in a convoy of 6 wagons and a strange delegation the capital had never seen before. The overseer of the Free Boundary, a mercenary captain in the finest chainmail, a merchant with a chest of samples, a priest with a traveling icon, the royal surveyor with a box of records, and a covered wagon with windows draped in cloth in which Krek traveled because Darren did not want to reveal the speaker to the crowd before the time was right. The codex had been left at home by the Boundary, but Work had prepared a portable extract from the register, certified by the white light of a fang, and this stack of sheets was the caravan's main weapon. The capital greeted them as it greets everything incomprehensible, with a mixture of horror and long lines. Rumors spread by the Duke gave Darren the kind of publicity Mon hadn't dared to dream of. People flocked from all over the city to catch a glimpse of the overseer who had sold himself to the beasts, and Mon turned the delegation's inn into an exhibition. Deep steel easily outshone the capital's blades. The ledgers lay open for any money changer to inspect. By the 3rd day, Arvenholm's money changers had begun accepting the Boundary Court's currency at a rate higher than that of baronial silver, and this told the capital more about Darren than all the rumors combined. Dukes paid a visit on the 4th day. The 2nd Chamberlain arrived without an entourage, and Darren saw for the first time the man who had killed his predecessor 19 years earlier. Dukes was not young, gaunt, and polite, almost like Work, except that Work's politeness was a trait, while Dukes's was a tool. The keykeeper didn't speak of the convention. He spoke of the stones. He asked how Darren had managed to reactivate the fangs, what he felt during activation, and whether the light of the spirals changed during overload. At some point, Darren realized with a shudder that his interlocutor wasn't pretending. He was genuinely interested. Dukes had struggled with the dead stones for 9 years and approached the living ones like a scientist approaching someone else's discovery. As he was leaving, the keykeeper paused in the doorway and said the only relevant thing. He said that a boy who came from nowhere couldn't possibly understand such a simple thing. The Boundary is too great a power to belong to random people. 19 years ago, he took the stones not out of greed, but because he saw where the world was headed. Dungeons are awakening throughout the kingdom, and one day, it won't be just one boundary that's needed, but a network of boundaries under a single command, and that hand must be trained, not random. Darren replied that a random hand had built a city and a world near Zev in half a year, while a trained one had built nothing but a mountain of lies in 19 years. Dukes nodded, as one does at a worthy move in a game, and left. The convention opened in the chamber's circular hall, where a registry stone, a dark boulder set in a bronze frame, lay on a raised platform. For 3 days, reports from the free cities were presented, and Darren sat there learning the rules of procedure, just as he had once learned to sharpen his fangs. On the 4th day, the case against Garoon was announced. The charges were read, not by Dukes, but by a lawyer hired by the college, and he read them forcefully. Conspiracy with the unholy, illegal coinage, a military gathering of monsters on the border of human lands, witnessed by 400 mercenaries. The hall buzzed with unease. Then the representative took the floor. Mon laid out the goods and the figures. Gaspar read aloud the charters from 12 villages where not a single soul had been harmed in the past 6 months. Breg brought in the condottiero Magnus Rowe, and the mercenary, under oath on the register stone, named the employer's office, and the stone remained cold, confirming the truth. A murmur rippled through the hall, because the agency in the capital was well known. And then Darren asked for the final witness to be brought in. Kreka was wheeled into the hall in his cart, and when the stone owl emerged into the light, the hall rose as one with a collective gasp. The guards grabbed their weapons. The presiding judge tapped his gavel. Verk, shouting over the commotion, read aloud the section of the regulations concerning the rights of a party to a land agreement, and his dry, formal voice made the guards even more tense. For the regulations were law in that hall. Krek approached the registry stone, placed his palms upon it, and took the oath. The stone flashed white. With that very white light, even the chamber's most senior legal experts regarded the scene as the second coming, for none of them had ever seen the stone's white response in their lifetimes. And then the speaker recounted the night from 19 years ago, about the sound of a horn from the surface, about the 4,000 subjects lured by the call into the meat grinder, about the overseer, old Marin, whom the creatures seized on the threshold against his will. Krek spoke calmly, and the stone glowed white with every word, and the hall was so silent that one could hear Verka's quill scratching. Dukes rose calmly from his seat. He said that the creature's testimony, no matter how brightly the stone glowed, required human confirmation, for so stipulated the code regarding witnesses. And that the horn in question was a fabrication, for not a single deep-dwelling horn was listed in any of the college's inventories. It was a strong position, and Dukes stood by it as firmly as if it were a wall. The code of witnesses did indeed require a human. There was no human among them. Everyone who could have seen that night through human eyes was dead. The courtroom began to sway, and Darren could physically feel his victory slipping through his fingers. And then, from the back rows of the public gallery, a man whom Darren did not know stood up. An elderly craftsman in clean but old clothes. He asked to speak regarding the code of witnesses, and identified himself as Tobias Green, a stone carver from the capital. 30 years ago, he had worked as an apprentice in the college's workshops. And 19 years ago, his guild, working on a confidential commission from the second keykeeper, had carved a tool from a deep tusk according to a blueprint they were ordered to forget. He could not forget the blueprint because he had been ashamed of that work his entire life. Gren placed his hand on the registry stone and, from memory, described the deep horn down to the very last groove, and the stone glowed white without fading. The old man said he had remained silent for 19 years out of fear, but had come today because he'd heard from the town criers that they were adjudicating a boundary that buried fewer shepherds than in his grandfather's time, and that shame had proved heavier than fear. The courtroom erupted. The presiding judge announced a recess that no one heard. Dukes stood motionless amid the commotion, looking neither at Gren nor at the presiding judge, but at Darren, and in his gaze there was neither hatred nor fear, but rather the cold recalculation of a man who had lost a round, but not the game. That same evening, the chamber ruled. The charges against Garoon were to be dropped entirely. His status as a free man was to be confirmed, with the right to choose his oath until spring. The acts committed 19 years ago were to be referred to the royal court, and the second chamberlain, Halvar Dukes, was to be suspended pending trial and taken into the chamber's custody. Guards arrived at Dux's residence in the capital around midnight and found the house empty. The study had been burned from the inside, along with all the papers. And on the only surviving table lay a note addressed to the overseer, Ziva, containing a single line written in calm, even handwriting. Dux wrote that the network of boundary markers would be built anyway, and that he was now free to build it without regard for the statutes. Below the line lay the old key to the college. The second keykeeper returned the key to the kingdom and went into hiding with everything he had learned about the boundary stones over the past 19 years. And when Darina returned home, Krek was waiting for her at the gates of the boundary court with a message from Garin, stating that the time had come to learn the price of the promised aid. The Lord of the Depths demanded neither cores nor marks as payment. He demanded that the keeper take the second dungeon under his jurisdiction. The Dead Maw, a 3-day journey to the north, whose boundary had been extinguished 19 years ago by that same duke, and where, according to intelligence from the depths, the fugitive keykeeper had already appeared twice. At the assembly in Arvenholm, Krek's testimony under the white light of the registry stone, and the sudden appearance of a human witness, the carver Tobias Gren, who had once crafted a deep horn commissioned by Duke, dismantled the charges and brought to light the murder of the former caretaker. The chamber acquitted the boundary, confirmed its status, and ordered Duke's arrest, but he burned the papers, returned the key, and went on the run, vowing to build a network of boundaries without regard for the law. Garin announced a price for military aid. Darren was obliged to incorporate into his boundary the dead northern dungeon, a boundary that had been extinguished 19 years ago, where the fugitive Duke had already been spotted twice. Darren spent 3 days' journey north simply to honestly admit to himself the obvious. Garin did not demand payment. Garin was handing him a war. The dead northern chasm was known to people as Wolf's Gap, but in the depths it bore a name that Krek translated as Hungry Sister. Once, according to the ancient reckoning of the depths, Garin's sister, a granite rank sovereign, had ruled there. 19 years ago, Dukes had extinguished that boundary in the same way he had extinguished Old Marin's. Only there he had gone further. He had descended into the extinguished chasm with a detachment from the college and a deep horn, and had taken the lady captive along with her heartstone. Since then, the Hungry Sister had been considered a dead dungeon. The creatures there had run wild without their mistress. The villages in the area had either died out or been abandoned. And for 19 years, Garin had been unable to enter it himself because an ancient law of the depths forbade a lord from stepping into another's chasm without a boundary mediator. Now, a mediator had appeared. That was the true price. Darren was to establish a boundary at Wolf's Gorge, thereby opening a lawful path for Garin to search for his sister, and at the same time to stand between the fugitive Dukes and whatever Dukes was seeking in the dead chasm. The caravan traveled through lands that Darren could not have imagined half a year ago. Scorched farmsteads, overgrown fields, a roadside chapel with a collapsed roof, where Father Gaspar insisted on holding a memorial service for all the nameless souls. By evening on the third day, they stopped on a hill above the gorge, and Darren saw the dead dungeon for the first time. The gorge was twice as wide as Garin, and nothing grew within a verst of it. The stench wafting from its maw was not that of a beast, but of a cellar. And in a circle, at equal intervals, the stumps of old boundary fangs, split by something heavy, protruded from the ground. Dukes hadn't merely erased the local boundary, he had executed it. Codex examined the nearest stump through a portable extract and delivered news that changed everything. The roots of the boundary markers were alive. The stone on top had been split, but the underground portion of each marker had survived and lay dormant. The dead boundary didn't need to be rebuilt. It could be awakened by placing a new stone on each root and pouring into its reawakening a sum commensurate with the age of the property. Codex named the amount, and Breg whistled. 90,000 marks. Almost everything the boundary had accumulated since the night of the high tide. Darren looked at the split stumps and wasn't thinking about the money. He was thinking about how ducks had appeared here twice and left empty-handed both times, because, without a living boundary, the codex of this place remained silent, and without the codex, it was impossible to find what Ducks was looking for. By awakening the boundary, Darren would open the archives of the dead domain, not just for himself. He would light a beacon that the fugitive keykeeper would come to for a third time, and this time, he would not come alone. He announced his decision briefly by the campfire. The boundary would be awakened. They worked for 3 weeks on the installation, which later went down in the annals of the Boundary Court as the Northern Ordeal. The guild's work crew carved new stones from the deep rock sent by Garen. The band transported them across the steppe in caravans under the protection of their leader. Krek, along with 2 younger speakers, marked out the routes. Darren himself placed each stone on a dormant root, just as he had done on the first night of his new life. Only now he had 40 hands to help him, and 90,000 marks to back him up. The old shepherd Yoram, the last resident of these parts, living out his days as a hermit in the ruins of the farmstead, became the skeptic of the strata. The old man came every day, sat down on a rock, and repeated aloud that it was all in vain, and that the chasm had devoured his sons and would devour the newcomers. On the night of the awakening, when 130 new fangs flared up at once, and a green ring closed around the dead chasm, for the first time in 19 years, Yoram stood in that light and wept openly. And the next morning, he asked to be entered into the Book of Residence as the first according to the Northern Count. The Codex of the Hungry Sister awoke sluggishly, like a person recovering from a long illness. It spoke with a stutter, losing its train of thought, but on the third day it revealed the most important part, the complete archive of the old boundary's final night. Darren and Verk, who had hurriedly arrived from the capital, read it until dawn. The archive confirmed everything Garen had said and added details unknown even to the depths. Dukes led the lady away, not to the Collegium. The records contained the route of his caravan, as recorded by the dying boundary in its final hours. The caravan did not head south toward the capital, but east into the mountains, toward a place the old codex called the Nest of Keys. And the archive also preserved the final entry by the guardian of that boundary, a woman named Agna Marin, sister of Olda Marin. The 2 guardians who were erased in the same year were brother and sister, and Dukes was erasing not just 2 boundaries. He was erasing the last family of the old school of guardians. Agna's entry broke off mid-sentence, stating that the keykeeper sought not power, but a point. Beyond that, the archive was silent. Neither the Codex nor Work nor Garen knew what this point was. The answer came a week later from the direction from which Darren had grown accustomed to receiving the worst news. That night, the northern boundary captured an intruder, a lone figure in a gray cloak, walking toward the chasm from the east, who paid the toll without resistance. The intruder requested a meeting with the guardian, and the guards led a woman of about 40 to the campfire, a woman with the face of someone who hadn't slept peacefully in a very long time. She identified herself as Selma Dux, the daughter of the second keykeeper. Selma spoke for 2 hours, and Darren listened without interrupting. She explained that her father hadn't always been that way, that 30 years ago, the young keeper Dux was the first in the college to figure out that the kingdom's dungeons didn't awaken on their own, but in a chain, like Knuckles, and that the chain originated from a single point deep beneath the mountains, that he submitted a report and the college ridiculed him, that he then decided to gather evidence himself at any cost, and the cost grew year after year until it consumed him entirely. He didn't extinguish the boundaries out of greed. According to his calculations, the living boundaries were the links in that very chain, and he dissected them as one would dissect a mechanism to understand its workings. He took the ruler of the hungry sister because, he was convinced, she remembered the way to the point of awakening. For 19 years, he held her in the nest of keys and achieved nothing because she remained silent. And now, Selma said, Father has finally lost his mind. After fleeing the capital, he took everything from the hiding places, including the horn, and went to the nest with his final plan. If the lady does not show the way to the point, he will blow the horn at full force right in her presence and unleash such a surge through all the chasms of the kingdom at once that the chain will reveal itself. Selma laid a folded sheet of paper on the ground by the campfire, a map of the nest of keys drawn by her own hand. She said she was betraying her father because she had read his calculations, and in them there was a line that he himself refused to see. A full blast of the horn with a 9 in 10 probability does not reveal the chain, but severs it. And then it is not a map of the dungeons that awakens. What awakens is that which slumbers at the point. The war council gathered in the guardhouse on the northern border, and it was the strangest council in the kingdom's history. For seated at the same table were a steward, a mercenary, a merchant, a priest, a royal surveyor, the daughter of a state criminal, and a stone owl speaking with the voice of the Lord of the Depths. They argued until they were hoarse over a single issue, whether to march on the nest of keys on their own, or hand the matter over to the crown. Verk insisted on the crown because the law is the law. Breg objected that by the time the capital mustered an army and finalized the paperwork, the Duke would have had time to sound his horn 3 times. Selma added that the nest had been built by the college's finest craftsmen, and storming it with an army would mean a year-long siege, and that her father, upon seeing the army on the horizon, would sound the horn immediately because he had nothing to lose. Garoon settled the dispute through Krek. The Lord said that an army wasn't needed. What was needed was a key, and the caretaker already had it. According to information from the depths, the nest of keys wasn't built on empty ground. Dukes had constructed it above the mouth of a small dead chasm to extract deep rock for his experiments. The small maw once had its own boundary, a tiny one, 7 fangs wide, long since extinguished. If the roots are still alive, the boundary can be reawakened right beneath the nest's foundation, and then everything inside the fortress will fall within the domain's boundaries, with all the rights that come with it, including a toll on trespassers and debtor status for those unable to pay. For 19 years, the Duke has held a captive of Granite Spark in the nest. Under the law of the boundary, this would be classified as the retention of another's property within the territory of the domain. The code could impose a penalty of such magnitude that it would crush any defense. The plan was madness at its fingertips. 7 people were to travel 300 versts through the mountains, secretly approach the fortress of the kingdom's most highly trained man, find the 7 sleeping roots beneath it, and awaken the boundary before they were spotted. Darren selected the men himself. He did so because the Fangs obeyed only the overseer. Breg and Tavish were his eyes and blades. Selma served as the guide. Krek acted as the liaison with Garen, and 2 young speakers served as stone bearers, for the Deep One's shoulders could carry 3 times as much as human shoulders. Mon stayed behind to manage the treasury and the rear. Gaspar stayed to pray, and in his words, that too was work. Verk left for the capital with a full report and Darren's oath that if the detachment perished, the crown would receive all the archives. The expedition took 18 days, and Darren remembered it in snapshots. The past paths where the wind knocked them off their feet, and the speakers carried stones in bundles like mountaineers. The night spent in a cave where Selma told for the first time how, as a child, her father had taught her to distinguish types of rock by their ring, and her voice broke for the only time during the entire journey as she told this story. The ford across the icy river where Tavish pulled Krek, who had slipped, out of the water, and the stone owl that spent the entire evening drying by the fire with mournful dignity, and the final nighttime descent into the valley, where the windows of the Nest of Keys glowed amid the rocks. The fortress was small, but cleverly built. 3 tiers carved into the rock, a single road, watchtowers with bell-ringing apparatus. Selma led the party along a goat trail to the scree slope at the rear of the fortress and pointed downward. There, beneath the foundation of the north wing, a small opening, blocked by debris, loomed darkly. They spent 2 days lying on the ground searching for the roots. They worked only in the pre-dawn hours when the sentries were nodding off. Codex probed the ground with a rod, while Darren dug through the rubble with his bare hands, feeling the faint warmth of the sleeping stone with his palms. They found all 7. 2 roots were right up against the wall, and they had to build up the stones around them with 4 hands, working as quietly as mice 30 paces from the watchtower. By the 7th night, everything was ready. 7 new fangs sat on the roots, covered with rubble, waiting only for the awakening infusion of the treasury, which Darren had brought in his belt in the form of top-grade deep-sea cores. He placed his palm on the nearest fang and froze, for a sound was coming from inside the fortress through the rock. A low, steady sound, part rumble, part moan, repeating at regular intervals. Krek pressed himself against the stone and said that it was the lady breathing. The hungry sister was alive and was close by, right behind the wall of the north wing. And then the sound changed. A second tone joined the breathing, high-pitched and rising, and Selma turned so pale that it was visible even in the darkness. She said she had known that sound since childhood. That's how the deep horn sings when it's being warmed up before the call. Father wasn't waiting for any set time. Father was preparing to sound the horn right now. Darren crushed the first pellet above his fang in his palm and commanded the awakening. 7 stones flared beneath the rubble, and the ring of the new boundary closed right through the foundation of the Nest of Keys. The codex of the small maw awoke instantly, as ravenous as a prisoner hearing a key in the lock, and its very first action was to present a reckoning to everything within the boundaries of its domain. A green wave seemed to sweep through the fortress from bottom to top. Shouts rang out from the watchtowers. The alarm system rang all the bells at once of its own accord. Light burst from the windows of the north wing. The codex reported dryly in Darren's mind. A toll has been collected from 26 armed individuals. 18 were deemed insolvent and transferred to the list of debtors to the domain's service. Foreign property of granite rank found in their possession. A claim was filed for 19 years of unlawful retention. The defendant is Halvar Dux. The claim cannot be covered by the defendant's entire estate. The defendant was offered debtor status. The defendant refused. And amid the clanging and shouts, a horn sounded from the heart of the fortress. It was an incomplete call. Dux had not had time to warm up the instrument and cut the call short halfway through, but even that half was enough to make the world tremble. The sound passed through stone, through flesh, through thoughts. In the valley, every living thing howled, and deep beneath the mountains, something responded, once. Like a sleeper who has been called by name but has not yet decided to wake up. The boundary held. The 7 fangs burned evenly and held the ring, and the horn fell silent, because the codex classified the call as destruction within the domain, and took its power from the horn just as a toll is levied. The instrument that Dux had nurtured for 19 years went out in 3 heartbeats. In the ensuing silence, the sound of bolts being unlocked inside the fortress could be heard. 18 debtors to the boundary, fulfilling the Dominion's first command, opened the gates of the nest from within. Darren's detachment entered the fortress at dawn without drawing drawing their weapons. In the north wing, behind a grill of deep steel, she stood, the lady-hungry sister, smaller than her brother, slimmer, darker, with a face as perfect and beautiful as a tombstone. She looked at Darren and spoke her first words in 19 years. She said she sensed in him the boundary of her brother and the boundary of her home, and asked if the old school had truly returned. And on the upper level, in the scorched experimental hall, amid the extinguished instruments, Halvar Dux sat on the floor, holding a dead horn on his lap and laughing quietly and eerily. Upon seeing Darren, the keykeeper laughed it off and said calmly, almost friendly, that the boy was too late to praise himself. Polozov disappeared into the depths. Tochka heard it, and now it doesn't matter who is right in their argument, because the judge will soon awaken. Dux was being transported north under the guard of the debtors of Mezi, and the entire way, the captive keykeeper behaved not like a prisoner, but like a scientist who had finally gained access to someone else's laboratory. He looked at the fangs, at the speakers, at the way Darren conversed with the codex, and asked questions that no one answered, and drew conclusions aloud that were impossible to ignore because they were so accurate. By the end of the journey, Darren caught himself hating this man, and at the same time realizing he couldn't afford the luxury of not listening to him. Because when it came to the point of awakening, Dukes knew more than anyone alive. The lady walked at her own pace alongside the caravan, and the earth sang beneath her footsteps. At Wolf's Gorge, she was met by Garen, who had emerged from another's maw for the first time in 19 years by right as a mediator between worlds. The meeting between the brother and sister of the depths lasted from sunset to sunrise, and not a single person heard what they spoke of, but the next morning, Krek relayed their joint message to the overseer. Polozov had reached the point. The sleeper did not awaken, but turned over in his sleep, and now the time between sleep and awakening is measured not in centuries, but in months. The depths know this from the tremor of the lower waters, and the depths know what the sleeper is, because during 19 years of silence, the lady has spoken her own memory to the very bottom. Darren listened to her story in the guardhouse at the northern border, along with Verko, who had been hastily summoned from the capital, and Dukes, whom he himself had ordered to be brought there because he had decided that disputes over granting the loser access to the truth were a luxury of peacetime. The sovereign spoke through Krek, slowly choosing human words to convey her inhuman memory. In the beginning, she said, there were no dungeons. There was only the depth, and in the depth lived the root, neither beast nor god, but that from which all that lay in the depths grew, just as a forest grows from a seed. Then the root grew weary and lay down to sleep, and so that his sleep might be undisturbed, the root's eldest children divided the depths into chasms and placed a pair at each chasm, a lord from within and a keeper from without. The boundaries, with their fangs and tolls, were not devised to collect claws. They were devised as a lullaby, a steady flow of power across the boundaries of the chasms, back and forth, rocked the root's sleep just as a cradle is rocked. As long as the boundaries sang, the root slept. The first keepers knew this. Then people fragmented that knowledge. It faded away, and all that remained of the lullaby were the tolls, which everyone interpreted as best they could. Dukes listened to it with the expression of a man being shown the solution to the problem of his entire life, and halfway through the story, he began to laugh again. Only now, the laughter was different, bitter. He said that for 30 years he had been searching for the point of awakening in order to prevent the awakening, that he had been extinguishing the boundaries, regarding them as links in an awakening chain, but the boundaries turned out to be links in a lulling chain. Every boundary he extinguished was a line torn from the lullaby. For 19 years, he had been awakening what he wanted to lull to sleep, and he nearly shouted himself hoarse with the half-call of his horn. Verk asked the lady if it was possible to sing the lullaby all over again. Darren remembered her answer word for word, because it was both a verdict and a plan. She said he could, provided that, by the day the root opened its eyes, all the boundaries of the old circle would be burning around it. The circle consisted of 9 gaps: Garin, the hungry sister, and the small gap beneath the nest, and 6 more extinguished ones scattered throughout the kingdom and beyond, whose roots might be alive or might be dead. 6 boundaries in a few months by the efforts of a single watcher. Darren looked at his hands, on which the calluses from that first night had still not worn away, and said that one watcher was not enough, and so there would have to be more watchers. Thus began what the Chronicles would later call the Year of the 9 Fires, though Darren himself simply called it a time of suffering. He made a move that shattered the centuries-old order. He opened a school for keepers right in the boundary court, and admitted into it everyone who had passed the Fang's test, because it turned out that the sleeping stones themselves could sense a worthy person, growing warm beneath their palm. The Fang recognized Selma Dukes, and she accepted the boundary of the small gap, atoning for her father's sin with her own. The Fang recognized Tavish, and the former archer departed with tears in his eyes that he made no attempt to hide. Click recognized the blacksmith's widow from old Yoram's tavern in the north, and one of the nest's debtors. Verk pushed through the chamber in emergency status for the new boundaries, and for the first time in 300 years, the crown entered dozens of names into the register of guardians. Mon secured a loan of 250,000 marks from 7 trading houses for this endeavor, to be repaid future tolls, and convoys carrying stones set out along the kingdom's roads. Garoon and the hungry sister provided each detachment with a speaker and 100 deep mine workers, and people and creatures set their fangs to work side by side, while Father Gaspar traveled between the construction sites and consecrated not the stones, but the labor itself, saying that the stones did not need his blessing. The kingdom's chancellor, Olgerd Vane, was named Skeptic of the Year. Until the very end, he called the whole thing the scam of the century and demanded arrests. The chancellor gave in on the day the 4th boundary of the circle flared up right outside the capital, and the tremor in the lower waters, which all the wells of Arvenholm had been sensing for a month, subsided overnight. Vane arrived at Darren's without an entourage, stood by the Fang, placed his palm on it, and the stone did not grow warm. The chancellor smiled wryly, said that at least he had been right about something, and signed everything the boundary had requested. By the end of the 8th month, 8 of the 9 fires were burning. The last gap in the circle remained, the farthest one, beyond the mountain ranges on the lands of the neighboring power of Cartezan, with which the kingdom had lived from war to war for 300 years. And when the Verka embassy returned from the Tezan court with a refusal as harsh as a slap in the face, Dux asked Darren for a private conversation and said that he would light the 9th fire. The Tezans had refused the crown, but they would not refuse a man who had traded with their college for 40 years, a man who knew their language, their fears, and their value. He asked neither for freedom nor for forgiveness. He asked for an escort, a safe passage, and one chance to end his life with the lyrics of a lullaby rather than a sentence of death. Darren thought about it for 3 days. He asked Selma, and she remained silent. He asked Verka, and Verka spoke of the law. He asked the lady, and she said that the depths do not forgive. But the depths know how to calculate, and that a dead dukes is worth nothing, while a dukes at the 9th maw is worth, perhaps, everything. On the 4th day, Darren signed the petition, and the crown, creaking with all its seals, released the state criminal under oath on the registry stone, and under the escort, 10 blades from Breg and a speaker. The caravan carrying the last stones disappeared beyond the ridges at the start of winter, and a month later, the tremor of the lower waters returned and grew day by day, and the lady said that the countdown had begun in weeks. The route was turning toward awakening. 8 fires kept the lullaby going at 8/9. And this was not enough, just as a single missing string is not enough for a song to remain a song. There was no news from the wagon train beyond the ridges. The lady revealed that this lullaby was what kept the ancient root of the depths asleep, and Dukes realized that for 30 years he had been awakening what he had wanted to put to sleep. Darren opened a school for guardians, where the Fangs themselves select the worthy, including Selma Tavish and Yoram. And in the 8 months of the Year of 9 Fires, together with the Depths, the Crown, and Mona's Loan, he lit the 8 boundaries of the circle, having won over the skeptical Chancellor Wayne. The 9th gap lies within the realm of Cartagena, which has rejected the crown, and Darren sent Duke off under Bregg's escort to light the final fire. The tremor in the waters has returned. The countdown is now in weeks, and there is no news from beyond the ridges. The wait proved to be harder work than any construction project, and for the first time, Darren understood people who turn gray in a single winter. The tremor in the lower waters grew, and it no longer required a special sense to detect it. The water in the wells of the Boundary Court swirled in circles. The dishes on the tavern shelves clinked at night. Ziva's creatures grew quiet and huddled close to the surface, just as livestock huddles against the doors before a storm. At Darren's request, the Codex translated the tremor into a simple scale from 1 to 100, and on the day the caravan departed, the scale read 11. A month later, it read 26. By midwinter, it had reached 40. And at 40, the lady said that at 70, the root would open its first eye. And even the memory of the depths did not know what would happen at 100, because such a thing had never happened before. Darren was preparing the world for the worst, as if the worst had already come to pass. At his command, and that of Chancellor Wayne, camps of the Royal Army were set up along all 8 fires, not for battle, but to maintain order, because panic kills before the catastrophe does. The Guild transported grain to underground warehouses. Gaspar, together with the roadside temples, set up shelters. Mon halted all trade except for that which was vitally necessary, and he did so voluntarily, a move that surprised Darren more than anything else in all the years they'd known each other. And the guardians of the 8 boundaries, in turn, maintained what the sovereign called a steady current. It turned out that the lullaby was sung not by the stones, but through them. A guardian had to stand for hours by the root fang, placing his palms on the spiral, and simply remain steady, not to be afraid, not to rush, not to desire. Darren stood his watch at Zev Garen's, and those were the strangest hours of his life because, through his palms, he heard Cornia's dream for the first time. The dream was vast and not malicious. There was neither hunger nor rage in it. There was only the endless, weary tossing and turning of one who has slept too long and whose sleep has become a burden to himself. At 52 on the scale, the first news arrived from beyond the ridges, brought not by the mail, but by the boundary. That night, all 8 lights of the circle flashed simultaneously in a single, coordinated beat, and the lady raised her head and said that the 9th root was alive. Someone far beyond the mountain ranges had touched the sleeping stone with a capable hand. The boundary could say no more, but even that was enough for the Boundary Court to sleep for the first time in a month. The details arrived 2 weeks later with the messenger Bregg, and those details were worthy of a song of their own. The caravan had arrived. The Tezen guard met them at the pass and intended to turn them back, but Dukes asked for a private conversation with the commandant and emerged an hour later with a safe conduct pass. No one knew what he had said to the commandant. In the city of Kar Azez, the Tezen College was waiting for them, and there Dukes did did something that not even Breg had expected of him. In public, in the square before their boundary stone, he swore an oath confessing to his own crimes. All 19 years. Both expunged boundaries. The murder of the Marin family, the Horn. The stone glowed white with every word, and the Tezens, who for 300 years had regarded the Royal College as a den of liars, saw a man from that very place who had burned himself with the truth. After that, the messenger said, they began to talk with them. The ninth chasm lay in the sacred mountains of Tezin, and the last local guardian of the chasm was still alive. An ancient old man from a lineage that had held the knowledge alone for 4 generations after their boundary had already been erased by Tezin's greed. The old man listened to Duke, looked at the stones they had brought, and said that he had been waiting his whole life without knowing what for. Construction was underway right now. The Tezin court had provided the workers. The trembling of the waters had convinced them more than any envoys could have. A messenger carried a personal letter from Duke to Darren, containing just 3 lines. The keeper wrote that the roots of the ninth were alive, but exhausted by 4 centuries of slumber, that the treasury's resources and the cores were insufficient to awaken such a boundary. According to the old man's calculations, and his own, a spark of a different kind was needed, a power of granite-like strength, freely given, a heartstone, whole. Darren read the letter in the guardhouse, and the lady read his face. There were 2 heartstones within reach, the one that Garen had paid to the boundary on the first day of their agreement, which lay in the treasury like a century-old toll, and the one that beat in the lady's own chest, because her stone, Dux, had never been able to tear it out in 19 years. Returning Garen's stone meant nullifying the centuries-old duty, and by the law of the boundary, the payer's consent was required. Darren went to Zev alone, without Krek, and spoke directly with the ruler for the first time since their initial meeting. He did not ask. He laid out the terms, as the Codex had taught him. Garen listened, the only way one can listen to a mountain, and then asked a single question. He asked whether the overseer understood that, by giving up the stone, the depths of Zev would be left without a reserve of power, in case the lullaby failed and the root awoke in a rage. Darren replied that he understood, and that if the lullaby failed, no reserve would save anyone. But if it succeeded, the reserve wouldn't be needed. He said that over the past year and a half, he had learned to calculate from the depths, and that this was an honest calculation. Garen remained silent. Then a stone hand rested on Darren's shoulder, and the Lord said that the first watchers had calculated the same way, and that now he finally believed in the return of the old school. The stone was transported beyond the mountain ranges by a special caravan, escorted by both lords all the way to the pass, and the tremor scale on the day the caravan set out read 61. At 68, the final message arrived. A dove from Breg with a single word, ready. At exactly 70, the lady stood in the middle of the square at the boundary court, raised her face to the sky, and said that the root had opened its first eye. The earth did not tremble. The earth sighed. In a long, sweeping motion from horizon to horizon, it rose and fell like the chest of one awakening. And throughout the kingdom at that hour, clocks stopped, dogs howled, and people fell silent. And then, beyond the mountain ranges, the ninth fire flared up. Darren did not see it with his eyes, but felt it with his palms, to the fang he was guarding. The final string returned to the lullaby. The 9 boundaries closed into a ring across half the world, and the current flowed smoothly and fully, as it had not for 4 centuries. Korn's sleep embraced the song. The immense stirring in the depths slowed. Its breathing grew rarer. Its eye closed. The tremor scale dropped before their very eyes, and when it passed the 30 mark, the sovereign sank to her knees right there in the square, and the 800 people around her did not immediately realize that the mountain was weeping. By spring, the scale had settled at 4, and the Codex reported that 4 was the natural baseline of peaceful centuries. Corin slept. The lullaby played on, and on the first warm day, Bragg's convoy returned from beyond the ridges, and the captain, dismounting at the gates, told Darren that he had brought everyone back alive except for one. Halvar Dux died at the 9th Fang, an hour after the Mezai awoke. Heart. The old keeper of the Tazen Mountains said over his body that the stone had taken the final toll from the man, and that the toll had been paid willingly. Before his death, Dukes managed to see the trembling fade, and his last words were a request to record in the register of the 9th boundary that the line of the lullaby had been returned to its place by the one who had torn it out. Selma listened to this, standing very straight, then went to her boundary and stood guard out of turn for a full day, and no one dared to interfere with her. 3 years passed, and in the spring of the 3rd year, Darren stood on the tower that no one called the Palisade Tower anymore, because the palisade had long since disappeared. There was a city. The boundary court had a population of 11,000, 4 market squares, a port on the river, an underground road with 6 tracks, and a wall of deep stone, built more for beauty than for war, because no one in the known world wanted to wage war against a city standing under the right of the boundary. Down below, in the main square, the spring fair was in full swing, and amid the clamor, people's voices mingled with those of the speakers, because the deep ones had long traded here, not just through a single crek, but through an entire quarter. The quarter was called the Lower Row. Children of both races played on its border, a game where one had to guess the weight of a stone in the palm of one's hand, and people lost more often than not. Darren watched all this and waited for his guests, because this was no ordinary day. Today, the first circle of 9 was gathering at the boundary court. The overseers of all 9 boundaries were convening for the first time, not because of a crisis, but in accordance with the charter they themselves had written. The charter was brief. The circle meets once a year to review the cradle, admit new overseers, and adjudicate disputes over boundary law. Verk, aged but having lost not a shred of his procedural precision, brought from the capital the royal charter by which the crown recognized the Circle of 9 as eternal and subject to no authority other than its own charter. Chancellor Wayne signed the charter, remarking that for the first time he was relinquishing power with a sense of relief. Guests arrived throughout the day, and Darren greeted each one personally at the gate. Selma Dukes, who in 3 years had rebuilt the mountain abode of the Guardians at the Small Gap, and brought 2 of her apprentices to the circle. Tavish, who held the border in the far west, and upon entering the gates, first checked the tension of the gate crossbow out of old habit, and was satisfied. Old Yoram, who had taken over the second northern boundary, when yet another dormant root was awakened at Wolf's Gap. The old man from Tezen, whose name was pronounced only by those who could speak it, and who brought Darren a gift, a pebble from Duke's grave, which lay near the 9th Fang. Brago was not a warden, but he was on the circle by right, a right the charter called the right of the first guard, and his word in disputes carried as much weight as that of the boundary. Mon was neither a warden nor a guard, but he had fought his way into the charter with the clause regarding the circle's treasurer, and for a year now, all 9 boundaries had been unable to decide whether that clause was their victory or his. The evening before the circle began, Darren slipped away from the guests and did what he did every year on this day. He walked along the first boundary, from fang to fang, all 47 stones of that first night. The calluses had long since worn off his palms, but his palms still remembered. At the 12th fang, where he had once first heard the many-voiced breathing from the cave, there was now a bench, and in the evenings the elders of the lower row would sit on it because the speakers liked that spot. At the 31st fang, where he had spent half an hour chiseling at the rocky ground with a splinter of a plank, that very plank was now embedded under glass, along with a plaque that Darren had been asking to have removed for 3 years, but the city had refused for 3 years. At the 47th fang, above the cliff, he sat on the rocks, watching the river as the lights of the barges passed by. Here, the lady caught up with him. Hungry Sister had never fully returned to her maw in those 3 years. She walked among the boundaries of the circle as a gardener walks among the trees, and people had grown so accustomed to her that children waved to her from the rooftops. She sat down next to him on the cliff, and for a while both of them were silent, the kind of silence that only those who had listened together to Cornia's dream can share. Then she said why she had come. The depths had finished the tally they'd been keeping for 3 years, a tally of everything that had changed. And according to that tally, the result was what the first watchers had only ever dreamed of. The steady current of the lullaby now flowed not only through the stones, it flowed through trade, through the lower row, through children's games of guessing a stone's weight. Every honest exchange between the races rocked Corn's dream like another hand on the cradle. The world itself was becoming the boundary. And so the depths decided it was time to fulfill the final clause of the ancient pact, one that people had never known about because they had never lived long enough to reach it. The lady placed a dark seed the size of a fist on the stones between them. She said it was Cornia's sprout. The sleeper gives it once per epoch to the side that has proven it can sing the lullaby. From the sprout, over the centuries, a new depth will grow, a new circle of chasms, a new life beneath other lands. And it is not handed over to the rulers. It is entrusted to the keeper. Darren held the seed in both hands, and it was warm, like a fang beneath a capable palm. He asked what he was supposed to do with it. The lady replied, nothing. Just keep it safe, and one day, pass it on to whoever the stones choose after him. The keeper is not the master of the sprout, just as he is not the master of the boundary. The keeper is the one who stands at the border and ensures that everyone who crosses it pays fairly and receives fairly. Everything else grows on its own. The next morning, the first circle of 9 convened, and Darren inscribed the sprout into the charter as the first entry, placing it above all duties and rights. The circle sat in session for 3 days and adjourned, having adopted 12 resolutions, among which were a school for overseers with a common charter, a registry of dormant roots on both sides of the mountain ranges, and a rule whereby any future boundary of the world would be incorporated into the cradle through a share of its current. And when the guests had departed and the city had quieted down, Darren did the last thing he had long intended to do. He asked the codex to bring up the very first entry, the one from that night with the bus bathed in white light, and the voice that had declared a random soul from the outer worlds to be the heir apparent. He asked the question he'd been afraid to ask for over 3 years. Was that coincidence truly a coincidence? The codex replied without hesitation, as if it had been waiting for the question all those years. The line of succession does not choose at random. The line of succession searches based on a single criterion. It seeks a soul who in their own world stood on the border and guarded it faithfully without even knowing it. The codex retrieved from Darren's memory what Darren himself considered simply a job, a night warehouse. A loader who, alone on his entire shift, never let substandard goods slip through, never signed fake delivery slips, and lost his job twice because of it. A man who held his small line in a world where the only reward for doing so was trouble. The stones chose him back then. Everything else was just the road that led here. Darren stood for a long time by the window of the guardhouse, which he never tore down, even though the city had offered him a palace 100 times. Below, a ring of 47 spirals burned, and beyond the river and the mountain ranges, 8 more rings burned, and all this light was a single song sung by the stones, the people, and the depths together. He blew out the lamp, lay down, and fell asleep immediately, sleeping as soundly as the root sleeps to a lullaby. In the morning, his usual work awaited him, to stand at the border, to count honestly, to guard the sprout. And this work was meant to last him a lifetime. And his life, by all accounts, was set to be a long one, because, as the old school watchman's records revealed, their lifespans were measured by the boundary, not by the body. He stepped out onto the porch with a mug of hot brew, nodded to the first morning caravan heading underground, and the codex, as usual and with steady rhythm, began a new accounting day in his mind. 3 years later, Mezhevoy Dvor became a city of 11,000 inhabitants, with the lower row of the depths, and the 9 overseers gathered for the first circle of 9, recognized by the crown's eternal charter. The sovereign presented Darren with the sprout of the root, the reward specified in the final line of the old pact, because honest trade had itself become part of the lullaby, and the codex revealed that the transfer had not been a coincidence. The council chose Darren because he had faithfully upheld his border, even in the former world. The story is complete. The root sleeps. The lullaby is sung from the 9 boundaries. The sprout is preserved in the circle's charter. And Darren remains who he was from the very first night, the guardian who stands at the border and counts with integrity.